When one brings up Studio Ghibli, the films that usually come to mind for most include My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle, all films directed by Hayao Miyazaki. What some people may not know is that of the 23 films that Ghibli has produced, Hayao Miyazaki only directed 11 of them, which to be fair is about half of their films, but the rest of their filmography was handled by a handful of other directors including Studio Panas's Hiromasa Yonebayashi and Miyazaki's son, Goro Miyazaki. These directors and their films tend to be overlooked, and while they do deserve more recognition, there is one director in particular that I wanted to focus on today. Along with Toshio Suzuki and Hayao Miyazaki, he is a founding member of the studio and is arguably just as influential at Ghibli as Miyazaki. If you are familiar with Studio Ghibli's history, then you probably know who I'm talking about. This is none other than Isao Takahata. This is someone I've been wanting to cover for a while now, but compared to someone like Hayao Miyazaki, not much about his life has been documented, so it was a bit tricky finding thorough information about him, at least not without some digging. It also doesn't help that he kept a lot of his life private. Well, now I think I've scrounged up enough to finally do this. So here it is, the life of Isao Takahata. Born on October 29, 1935 in the prefecture of Mie, Isao Takahata was the youngest of 7 children. Quite the contrast to the modern Japanese family. His family would eventually relocate to Okayama where his father worked as a junior high school principal. Takahata would spend the majority of his childhood in Okayama, and it is here where he experienced the horrors of war firsthand. In June of 1945, 138 US bombers dropped an estimated 100,000 incendiary shells onto the city, setting it ablaze. In an attempt to seek shelter, Takahata and his older sister were separated from the rest of the family amidst the panic and chaos. As the bombing raged on, his sister would be knocked unconscious by a bomb fragment, and Takahata would have to shake her awake. The two eventually found safety by a riverbed and reunited with the rest of the family after the raid.
したんです。実際その姉はそれで怪我をしてかなり傷が残ったりしてましたけど、でしかもそれで親と別れて実際に親と会ったのは2日後ぐらいなんですね。やっと会えたの。非常に生々しく体験した人間としてですね、自分の人生の中で一番大変だった体験ではなかろうかと思うんですが。
Upon returning home, Takahata would come across the dead bodies of others who also tried to escape the air raid, including those who had suffocated in a bomb shelter that he thought of seeking safety in. Isao Takahata was 9 years old at the time. He rarely spoke of his accounts during World War II, as he believed his experiences were not as noteworthy compared to others who he thought had gone through much worse. Skipping ahead a little, Takahata would end up attending the University of Tokyo where he studied French literature. During his time there, he came across the French animated film Le Roi et l'Oiseau, The King and the Mockingbird, which helped ignite his interest in animation. After graduating in 1959, Takahata was persuaded by a friend to apply at Toei to pursue his passion. He passed the entrance exam and was hired as an assistant director at the studio, despite not being an artist, which is wild. I doubt that happens much anymore. It is here at Toei where Takahata would meet his eventual longtime colleague and friend, Hayao Miyazaki, and their mutual mentor, Yasuo Otsuka. Miyazaki dubbed Takahata Paku-san due to how he would quickly eat his breakfast in the mornings, paku-paku being the Japanese onomatopoeia for munch-munch. Takahata had the opportunity to work as an assistant director on various television and film productions at Toei. His mentor Otsuka would eventually give Takahata the chance to direct his own feature film, which would end up being Horace, Prince of the Sun. Takahata, Miyazaki, and Otsuka would all work on this film together. Otsuka served as the animation director, while Miyazaki was the scenic designer and a key animator. The production of Horace experienced many delays and ended up taking around 3 years to make, much longer than the usual 8 to 10 month schedule that Toei practiced at the time. Horace became the most expensive anime film until 1977 with a budget of 100 million yen, or 278,000 USD. That's roughly around 2.5 million USD at the time of recording. Unfortunately, Takahata's first film would end up being a flop and had its showing stopped only 10 days after release. That sounds a little familiar. This commercial failure would cause Takahata to get demoted back to assistant director. Despite flopping commercially, Horace, Prince of the Sun has now become somewhat of a cult classic in Japanese film. Takahata struggled to recover from Horace's flop and never directed for Toei again, being stuck as an assistant director for the rest of his time there. He would end up leaving Toei in 1971, along with Miyazaki and another animator named Yoichi Kotabe, due to having differing ambitions and priorities that of Toei. The three joined A Production, where Takahata and Miyazaki most notably co-directed 17 of the 23 episodes of Lupin III Part 1. The duo eventually pursued adapting the stories of Pippi Longstocking into an animated feature film. Takahata and Miyazaki had storyboards made and even traveled to Sweden for location shots, although after being unable to meet the author, Astrid Lindgren, to acquire the rights to use the character, they could not reach an agreement. Thus, the duo had to abandon the project. In 1973, Zuiyo Enterprise would approach Takahata, Miyazaki, and Kotabe to adapt Johanna Spree's book, Heidi, into an animated series. The adaptation would result in Heidi, Girl of the Alps, which would end up recycling elements from their Pippi Longstocking's development. In 1975, Zuiyo Enterprise split into two companies, the half mainly consisting of the production staff ultimately becoming Nippon Animation. Takahata and Miyazaki would continue to work at Nippon Animation for several more years, contributing to works such as The Dog of Flanders, 3000 Leagues in Search of Mother, Future Boy Conan, and Anne of Green Gables. After working on Anne of Green Gables, Miyazaki would leave Nippon Animation for Telecom, and Takahata would follow suit. There, the two reunited with their former mentor, Yasuo Otsuka. Takahata would direct both the animated feature and TV spin-off of Jarinko Chie, while Miyazaki would direct his first feature film, Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro. Telecom eventually would start attempting to launch a project that was meant to be a joint production between Japanese and American animators. They did this in order to help Japanese animation break into the US market. The product would be an adaptation of the Little Nemo comic, and the story behind its production is a whole mess of its own. So to keep it light, Miyazaki and Takahata were both candidates to direct the Japanese side of things. Miyazaki joined the project first, and Takahata was supposed to join a little later as he was busy with another project. However, due to creative differences, Miyazaki not only left the project but also Telecom, leaving Takahata to take the task alone once he was able to work on it. Takahata also disagreed with the direction of the film, so he too left the project and Telecom. It makes you wonder how bad things were getting. The film would end up being made many years later as Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, Takahata and Miyazaki having no involvement in it. After Takahata and Miyazaki departed Telecom, both of them took a small break from their work. Well, more so Takahata. Miyazaki would begin working on creating manga such as Shuna's Journey and more famously, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Both of Miyazaki's manga were published in the magazine Animage, where future Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki was working as an editor at the time. Seeing that the Nausicaa manga was achieving some success, Suzuki proposed the idea of perhaps adapting Nausicaa into a short film. Miyazaki wasn't too keen on the idea, believing a longer runtime would suit it better. Eventually, Animage's parent company Tokuma Shoten greenlit a feature-length adaptation of Nausicaa. Miyazaki brought on Takahata onto the production and made him producer of the film, which Takahata was not too happy about. Topcraft would end up being selected as the studio commissioned to animate the film, although Miyazaki did not find their staff dependable. Therefore, he would bring on previous collaborators from other studios onto the production. To compose the film, Takahata brought on Joe Hisaishi, who would become Miyazaki's go-to composer for future films. Nausicaa was a success both critically and commercially. Looking ahead towards the future, Topcraft was considered again to animate the next Miyazaki film. However, in 1985, the studio went bankrupt and closed down. But where one story ends, another one begins. After the closure of Topcraft, Hayao Miyazaki, Isao Takahata, and Toshio Suzuki went on to found Studio Ghibli with the help of Tokuma Shoten. Miyazaki would be the one to name the studio, taking the Libyan Arabic word Ghibli, meaning hot desert wind. It was the name of an Italian aircraft as well, the Caproni Ka 309 Ghibli. Now you may have noticed that I said Ghibli there instead of Ghibli like I usually do. But let me explain real quick for those who may not know. So the word in Arabic is actually pronounced Ghibli with a hard G. But when the word was written out in Japanese for the studio name, the katakana character that would coincide with the G ended up being the character G, making it sound like a soft G. So really, saying Ghibli or Ghibli is fine. I just say Ghibli because that's how the studio decided to name themselves. Something similar happened to Studio Ponok, where they took the Serbo-Croatian word for midnight, Ponoch, and wrote it as Ponok in Japanese. Miyazaki chose this word as he wanted the studio to blow a whirlwind into the stagnant Japanese animation industry at the time, and also he likes planes. Many of the people Miyazaki and Takahata brought on for Nausicaa at Topcraft would end up being hired to work at Studio Ghibli. In 1986, Ghibli would release their first feature film, Castle in the Sky, again directed by Miyazaki and produced by Takahata. With Takahata as producer again, he urged that the film's production should sustain the highest standard even if it meant going over budget, and it seems that decision would pay off, as it became another success for the duo, but more importantly, the first success for the studio. Takahata would eventually direct his first feature for the studio, Grave of the Fireflies, which would be released alongside Miyazaki's My Neighbor Totoro in 1988, although it was surprisingly not his first work for the studio. Takahata's first ever contribution to Studio Ghibli was actually a 1987 live-action documentary about the city of Yanagawa, the story of Yanagawa's canals. Pretty straightforward title there. The documentary was a television special for NHK that covered the city's history and the hardships the locals faced to preserve the canal system due to water pollution. Prior to Castle in the Sky's production, Takahata was inspired to make the film after spending a few months in Yanagawa for a research trip. The trip was meant to be for Miyazaki's potential next film, but that potential film ended up being scrapped. While Takahata was there, he got to speak with the head of the region's water supply, which influenced him to document the lives and struggles of the people. Miyazaki would assist with creating animated sequences that depicted the past of the city. The budget of the film was made up of half of the profits that Nausicaa made, and Takahata was given 1 year to make the film. In typical Takahata fashion, he went over budget and it took 3 years to make. Takahata was insistent that the lives of these people be portrayed authentically, causing him to return to the city on multiple occasions. Miyazaki would even pull from his personal savings to finance the documentary, putting him in debt. This scare would prompt Miyazaki to start developing his next film to recoup his losses. The film would end up being Castle in the Sky. Despite being one of his lesser known works, a lot of aspects and themes from this film would seep into Takahata's later films, such as the relationship between humanity and nature, nostalgia, and the importance and value of community. Soon after working on the story of Yanagawa's canals, Takahata started working on his first feature film for Studio Ghibli, Grave of the Fireflies. The film would be based on the 1967 semi-autobiographical short story of the same name by Akiyuki Nosaka. Before he allowed Takahata to adapt Grave of the Fireflies, Nosaka had been approached by others to adapt the story into live action. He declined every time as he did not believe it was possible to recreate the quote-unquote scorched earth that's to be the backdrop of the story, and he also thought that potential child actors could not effectively portray the characters. When an animated version was pitched to him, it caught him by surprise. However, Nosaka was convinced that animation was the best medium for the story to be adapted in, after seeing how accurately the rice paddies and towns were depicted in the storyboards. Takahata wanted to use more experimental methods of animating, but due to the film already having a set team, schedule, and release date, he was discouraged to do anything that would set the film back. He had also just come off another project that faced multiple delays, so they didn't want that again. Fortunately, this did not affect the quality of the film. Takahata would incorporate his own experiences from the Okayama bombings in order to illustrate a more accurate depiction of what air raids were like.
実際にガラガラ降ってきて、それでボンボン燃えて、その中をこう水をかぶったりしながらですね、縫うように逃げ惑っていくうちにだんだんむしろ火が火事のなんていうか燃える状態が激しくなっていくところに突っ込んでいって。
When it came down to animating Setsuko's cremation, Takahata had multiple incomplete cuts made before deciding on one. He wanted to make sure that the most sincere iteration made it into the film. The other cuts were never finished or seen outside of the production staff. The film was initially released with My Neighbor Totoro as a double feature and was critically acclaimed. Despite not achieving what Castle in the Sky had at the box office, Grave of the Fireflies was still considered a success. Legendary director Akira Kurosawa even personally praised the film, and had claimed it to be his favorite Ghibli film, albeit he sent the letter to Miyazaki thinking he directed the film instead of Takahata. Grave of the Fireflies would end up being arguably Takahata's most famous and influential film, yet there was still more to come. The next film that Takahata would direct would be Only Yesterday, released in 1991. Initially, Miyazaki was the one who was interested in adapting its original manga into a film, seeing the potential it had as a children's story, although he was not feeling up to it at the time and passed the idea on to Takahata. Miyazaki did stay on as a production producer while the film was being made. Something unique about Only Yesterday was its unorthodox production pipeline, at least in Japanese terms. In the anime industry, scenes are usually animated before the voice lines are recorded. For Only Yesterday, it was the other way around, having the voice actors do their lines first. Takahata would even record the voice actors doing their lines together, so he could use their performances as reference for animation and even character designs. This resulted in the film looking more realistic. One thing that Takahata struggled with was trying to translate the episodic nature of the manga into a film. The manga was mainly about a little girl named Taeko going about her daily life. To make it flow better as a film, he decided that the story would be about adult Taeko, reminiscing about her childhood while she takes a retreat to the countryside. This allowed Takahata to interject storylines that were originally from the manga. Despite its success in Japan, it would be a while until it reached Western audiences. Germany, the UK, and Australia would all be the first to get some sort of release. Disney, who were Ghibli's North American distributors at the time, refused to release it, allegedly due to the mention of menstruation cycles in the film. In 2011, G-Kids would acquire the North American distribution rights for Ghibli, eventually dubbing and releasing Only Yesterday theatrically in 2016, 25 years after it came out in Japan. Unfortunately, there's not much documented on the productions of Takahata's next two films, Pampoko and My Neighbors the Yamadas, but here is what I did find based on IMDb trivia, so take these next few things with a grain of salt. Before working on Pampoko, Takahata wanted to adapt the Japanese epic poem The Tale of the Heike into a film. The poem is about rival clans, the Taira and Minamoto, and their struggles to control 12th century Japan. However, Miyazaki was already working on Princess Mononoke at the time, which had a similar setting, so Takahata had to settle for a different premise, which I don't know about you, but I would have been fine with both. Takahata had based the character Gonta on Miyazaki, who heavily denied being similar to. Miyazaki was also allegedly caught crying when watching the film. Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki claimed that it probably reminded him of his younger days. Pampoko was created in a way that made it feel like a documentary. It covered the situation that the Tanuki were facing and how they were dealing with it. This reflected the urban growth of Tokyo throughout the 80s and how it was affecting the nature around there. Now knowing that Takahata actually did a documentary about a decade before this, I can see how it influenced the way that Pampoko was made. He was still able to add fantasy elements into the film, giving it the Ghibli charm. As for My Neighbors the Yamadas, it was based on a gag-style manga of the same name. When adapting it into a film, Takahata wanted the art style to resemble watercolor drawings. To achieve this, the production switched over from using traditional animation to digital animation, making the Yamadas the first ever entirely digital Ghibli film. While it was praised critically upon release, it did not see the same success as the films before it. And that's all about I got for the Yamadas. These two films tend to be overlooked compared to Takahata's other works at Ghibli. Admittedly, they're not my favorite Ghibli films, but I think I do like him more than most people do. They're some of his more experimental works, and are still good films at the very least. You can tell through these films that Takahata very much cared about the craft of filmmaking and animation, trying to find the best ways to tell each story. But after the Yamadas, it would be a while before he directed another film for Ghibli. In 2003, Japanese director Kihachiro Kawamoto would release the animated film Winter Days. The film was based on the Japanese poet Basho's collection of poems of the same name. Kawamoto assembled 35 leaders of the animation world and had them independently create 30-second visuals for each of the 36 stanzas of the poem. That's a lot of 30s. Isao Takahata was amongst these collaborators and was in charge of stanza number 28. I can't really say much on the film as I've only seen Takahata's segment, and even then, I don't really think it's a film for me. I believe you can still find the film on YouTube in crunchy quality if it's something that interests you. There would be no word on whether Takahata was working on a new film or not until 2008. In February of that year, the president of Ghibli at the time would announce that Takahata and Miyazaki's son, Goro, were both developing new films. Hints of what Takahata was working on would be sporadically given to the public until 2009 at the Locarno International Film Festival, where Takahata finally revealed what it was. This film would be based on the 10th century Japanese folktale, The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, a story that he and many other Japanese people read growing up. Takahata believed that the original story, while having potential to be enjoyable, was difficult to understand. He wanted to give the story more depth, so that the audience empathized more with the protagonist, Princess Kaguya. Toei did almost adapt the story into a film when Takahata was first hired there. He brought up his concept of focusing more emotionally on the character of Kaguya, but was ignored. Toei eventually scrapped the film, finding it too difficult to make, although Takahata still saw appeal in his concept decades later. What really pushed for Takahata's vision to finally be realized was a financial backing of former Nippon TV president Seiichiro Ujiie. Ujiie was a big fan of Takahata's works, claiming My Neighbors the Yamadas as his favorite. He approached producer Toshio Suzuki and begged him to get Takahata to create one more film. Suzuki obliged and convinced Takahata to make one more. Ujiie ended up financing the film, giving 5 billion yen or 40 million USD. Sadly, he would never see the final product as he passed away in 2011, 2 years before the film's release. At the very least, he was able to see the script and some storyboards. Again, Takahata used a brushstroke watercolor style to animate the film.
自分はそのもうセルアニメはもう嫌でやりたい、いわゆるセルアニメはもうやりたいと思ってなかったからなずっと。でそれの第一歩としての山田君だし、でもそれからもしやるとしたら いわゆるセルアニメをやるつもり全然なかったんですね。
The Tale of the Princess Kaguya was meant to be released in the summer of 2013 alongside Miyazaki's The Wind Rises, but was pushed to fall of 2013 due to delays in production. While receiving critical acclaim, the film only made back half of its budget through the international box office. The film was later nominated for Best Animated Feature at the 2014 Oscars, losing out to Big Hero 6. After the film's release, Takahata expressed interest in making another film despite claiming that he'd retire after Kaguya, although he didn't think it would happen due to his age. And unfortunately, it would seem that he would be right, because in 2018, Isao Takahata was diagnosed with lung cancer. He would pass away on April 5th, 2018. Even though Takahata would never direct again, he still had a hand as a producer in one more film, The Red Turtle, which was released in 2016. While Ghibli didn't animate the film, they did help finance it, helping it become realized. It would be the first time that Ghibli produced a foreign film, and perhaps not the last. While not as well known as Miyazaki, Isao Takahata very much influenced not only Studio Ghibli, but the Japanese animation industry. Even though he did not draw or animate, he was still able to direct some of the most beautiful, artistic, and human films in animation. He often delayed his productions because of how meticulous he was about getting the film right, experimented with many forms of storytelling. His love and care for the craft was one of a kind. Together with Hayao Miyazaki and Toshio Suzuki, they created an empire of fantasy and dreams. It is just a shame he was not able to make as many films as Miyazaki. It makes one wonder what was the next film he had in mind after Kaguya. At the very least, we have this wonderful legacy that he left behind. A legacy that'll hopefully inspire others and remind them of the beauty of humanity.